Just over a century ago, a deadly pandemic ravaged the Earth, claiming the lives of anywhere between 20 and 100 million people, potentially surpassing the casualties of the preceding Great War. Surprisingly, this pandemic, known as the Spanish flu, was largely forgotten and downplayed by governments and media outlets worldwide. It earned its name because the Republican leadership in Spain continued to report on it, while other governments refused to acknowledge its severity. Only in recent decades has the true scale and historical significance of this outbreak been recognized, as it potentially had as much impact on humanity as the First World War. Similar to earlier pandemics throughout history, such as the Plague of Athens, the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Justinian, and most notably, the Black Death, the Spanish flu was a deadly disease that particularly affected those with limited knowledge of how to combat it. It decimated large portions of the population between 1918 and 1920. Approximately half to two-thirds of the world's population became infected, with an indiscriminate death rate of around 5%. Although not as high as the mortality rate of the Black Death, the interconnectedness of the 20th century meant that both the young and the old were affected. Despite the high mortality, the majority of people survived, which paradoxically contributed to the virus's spread to every corner of the globe. However, after the mass graves were filled and the deadly plagues throughout history subsided, people returned to their lives, picking up where they had left off, and sometimes even experiencing improved conditions. For instance, after the Black Death in the 14th century, the peasantry in England, despite being fewer in number, found themselves in higher demand, leading to social mobility and laying the groundwork for the emergence of the middle class. Similarly, after the plague in the 17th century, social unrest paved the way for the success of the parliamentary system and the end of absolute monarchy in England. Following the Spanish flu, the world entered the Roaring Twenties, marked by cultural advancements in cinema, music, literature, aviation, and art. Although this era was brief and often overshadowed by the Great Depression of the 1930s and the subsequent Second World War, it was a period of prosperity, social mobility, and change. So, how did the world recover from the Spanish flu? Let's delve into it. The Spanish flu, which occurred between 1918 and 1919, holds the grim distinction of being the deadliest and most widespread pandemic in history. However, due to incomplete or non-existent census records from that time, it remains impossible to determine the exact death toll. Estimates suggest that it could have reached as high as 100 million, with the lowest figures around 20 million. Considering the global population of less than 2 billion at that time, the implications are staggering. In the United States alone, at least 675,000 lives were lost, and well over 500 million people worldwide were infected. Despite the immense challenges posed by the simultaneous global conflict and the pandemic, much of the world experienced a remarkable recovery. The United States witnessed a surge into the prosperous Roaring Twenties, and Germany enjoyed a brief period of stability and growth under the Weimar Republic until the Wall Street crash of 1929 reshaped everything. It's noteworthy that these recoveries occurred in an era before widespread air travel, when people tended to remain in one area for most of their lives. Now, let's explore how the Spanish flu initially spread. When the H1N1 influenza virus first emerged, the United States had been actively involved in the European theater of the First World War for over a year. Tens of thousands of soldiers traveled across the Atlantic to the front lines, and production lines were in full swing to meet the demands of war materials and combat gear. It was during this mass movement of people that the first reports of illness emerged, starting at Fort Riley in Kansas in March, and soon after in New York. The flu spread rapidly, infecting around 1,100 people at the camp, with 38 deaths attributed to pneumonia. Similar to any cold or flu, the Spanish flu spread to new hosts through droplets expelled into the air when someone sneezed, coughed, or even spoke. These droplets could survive outside the body for extended periods and could also be transmitted through touch. Despite the growing cases, the war effort continued without pause, as no individual had the power to halt it. American soldiers traveled back and forth between Europe and the United States, spreading the virus further. To maintain high morale as the war shifted in favor of the Allied powers, European governments tightly controlled the media, downplaying the severity of the disease. Meanwhile, reports from various European countries, including Britain, France, Germany, and Spain, presented conflicting information, with Spain being particularly hard hit. Consequently, the flu, likely originating from a Kansas farm, became known as the Spanish flu due to its association with American troops traveling to and from Europe. The disease rapidly spread between continents and eventually worldwide. Despite governments' attempts to dismiss it as nothing more than a virulent strain of flu, the Spanish flu had a significant impact on countries such as England, France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. Initially, the illness affected people of all ages, but the majority of deaths occurred among the elderly and infants, sparing healthy individuals between the ages of 20 and 40. As spring transitioned into summer, new infections declined, leading many to believe the worst was over. Loose social distancing measures were lifted as people anticipated the eradication of the disease. However, due to limited means and education to effectively combat the virus, coupled with the ongoing war effort, most countries did not respond adequately during the initial wave. The general lack of awareness seemed inconsequential, at least temporarily. Life returned to a state of normalcy, if it had even been disrupted in the first place. However, everything was about to change. While America and Europe were easing their restrictions and celebrating the imminent end of the war, the Spanish flu had a surprise in store. In the medical camps of Europe, filled with tens of thousands of vulnerable recovering soldiers, a more dangerous and merciless strain of the virus was mutating. This new version directly attacked the respiratory system, making it highly contagious and deadly. Unlike the previous strain, this one did not discriminate and posed a threat to all age groups. When the second wave of the Spanish flu arrived in the autumn and winter of 1918, Europe and America, interconnected through trade networks and colonial ties, were caught unprepared. There were no effective cures, drugs, or antibiotics available to combat the rapid spread of the virus. As a result, the infection and fatality rates were terrifyingly high, especially among those soldiers who had already suffered physical and mental traumas on the battlefield. Medical professionals could only watch helplessly as the greatest generation succumbed to the disease, with soldiers dying by the thousands, drowning in their own mucus as their lungs filled with fluid. Unfortunately, there were no nationwide lockdowns or comprehensive strategies implemented to curb the spread of the virus. This lack of action allowed the new, deadlier strain of the Spanish flu to take hold rapidly. Tens of thousands of deaths soon turned into hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions. It seemed that the virus was left to run its course, as a vaccine wouldn't be developed until the 1940s. In America, responses to the second wave varied from state to state and city to city. In Philadelphia, despite constant warnings from scientists, the public health director assured civilians that the returning soldiers were simply suffering from the flu and that the infection would soon be contained. The city even refused to cancel its Liberty Loan Parade. However, within days, hospitals were overwhelmed, and the death rate surged. In contrast, St. Louis acted promptly after detecting the first cases, implementing strict restrictions, discouraging crowds, and deploying physicians to diagnose potential symptoms on the streets. San Francisco advocated heavily for the use of face masks, eventually making it illegal to not wear one in public. New York implemented staggered schedules for businesses and public transportation to avoid overcrowding. Over time, Philadelphia and other cities were forced to close schools, theaters, and public spaces, but only after experiencing devastating death tolls and widespread infections. The delayed implementation of social distancing measures in many American cities led to tragic spikes in death rates, particularly in densely populated urban centers. By the end of October, more than 200,000 people had died from the virus in the United States alone. Bodies piled up in makeshift morgues, and cities were overwhelmed. However, by December, the death rate finally began to lower, and cities started to relax their lockdown restrictions, believing the pandemic was ending. But once again, this assumption proved to be fatal. In January, the third wave of the Spanish flu arrived with full force. National and local leaders, failing to act quickly enough, struggled to contain the outbreak. Public transport faced shortages in personnel, and many people refused to wear face masks or follow social distancing rules. Civil unrest and criticism of governments ensued. The lack of consistent nationwide planning and containment strategies resulted in sustained damage and death rates in urban centers. Misunderstandings about health products and high prices for face masks further complicated the personal battle against the flu. Although advice was provided through newspaper cartoons, it varied significantly from town to town. As the summer of 1919 arrived, the worst seemed to be over, and recovery began. However, a fourth wave hit in the early months of 1920, causing widespread panic. Fortunately, this wave was milder, with most people experiencing fatigue, headache, and a sore throat. After close to 2 years, the world could finally move on from the Spanish flu. In the aftermath, the US and Europe faced economic recession, but eventually recovered. The increased wages for workers and growing focus on consumer manufacturing in the US led to economic growth in the 1920s. Life expectancy improved, and investments in science and medicine increased, resulting in a better understanding of viruses and improved containment measures. The soap and pharmaceutical industries thrived during the pandemic, and research budgets for infectious disease laboratories grew. This, combined with increased consumer spending on medicine and health products, benefited organizations and small businesses. The focus on technology and consumer electronics began, revolutionizing the world. The shortage of workers caused by the pandemic led to increased wages and social mobility. People found new jobs in factories, which contributed to the growth of the American middle class. Consumer spending surged, urban centers expanded, and healthcare access improved. However, the heedlessness toward economic instability and the subsequent 1929 stock market crash led to intense poverty and hardship in many countries, including Germany. The Great Depression and the rise of fascism marked the beginning of another challenging era. Despite the devastating consequences, the Spanish flu pandemic brought about significant changes. It reshaped economies, increased investments in science and medicine, and altered perspectives on life. It propelled societies forward, even though it also led to great suffering.